The Gulf of St. Lawrence, a shallow shelf framing part of the mighty Atlantic Ocean's northwest corner, is not a body of water that commands the same attention in popular imaginations across the globe as might the Mediterranean Sea, the South Pacific, or the Bay of Bengal. And yet, along the shores of a tiny mound of sand rising from the Gulf, there is a rich history embedded in the blood-red soil and within the hearts of the people who settled the land for more than 600 generations. Some came here for salvation, others for profit, others for a better life. Some found fortune here, others tragedy and ruin. Some called this place Epekwitk, others Ile Saint-Jean. On today's maps, this place is officially called Prince Edward Island. But for the islanders of the distant past, as for the islanders of today, this place is called but one name across countless languages: home. This series is a brief accounting of some important moments in the history of Prince Edward Island. It is the history of a small place, involving a relatively small network of peoples. But this is not to say nothing of importance has ever happened here. Indeed, throughout the history of the island, as in every other place across the globe, the only constant has been change. Sometimes slow, sometimes swift and violent, and always with consequences for those who would come later. A history of Prince Edward Island must begin with the people who have lived here on these shores for millennia, more than 12,000 years by the reckoning of elders and scholars. Their ancient ancestors arrived long before the last ice age ended. It was only when the rising sea swallowed up the tract of land we now call the Northumberland Strait that this place became an island. The people called it Epekwitk, roughly translated to English as lying in the water. And those who lived here called themselves simply Olnu, the people. Today, they are also called Mi'kmaq.
Gwe, Jalasi, Deloisi Julie. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Julie Pellissier-Lush. I am the knowledge keeper at Olnue. I'm also the current poet laureate of Prince Edward Island. Plate is very full, but it's very good, and I am able to meet with elders and accumulate knowledge and stories from them as much as I can. Mi'kmaq was our traditional unceded territory, and it included PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, parts of Quebec, Newfoundland, and it goes all the way down to like Presque Isle, Maine. And that area was divided into 7 districts. And those 7 districts were actually looked after by regional chiefs that were called our captains. And it's Keptin. And the captain would be an elder male who would represent the whole district. So the captain of Prince Edward Island would be responsible for that, also the part of Pictou. And anything that happened as a dispute in our district would have to be decided by the captain. And the captain of each of the districts would have to trek to the Grand Council. And a captain would be similar to a premier. They are the ones who lead that whole district. So it would be very, very similar to a premier of a province. And then when you get up a little bit higher, you have the Grand Council, and the Grand Council is run by the Grand Captain. The Grand Captain would be almost like the Prime Minister. He would be in charge of all of Mi'kmaq. If there was a dispute between 2 districts, it would come to the Grand Captain. So when we had our communities in the summer, we would come together and we would live in great big community groups in the spring, the summer, and the fall. Thus, we would have our powwows, our mawiomis, our gatherings, because we would all be together. And as we were gathering and being together, we had different communities, and each community had a chief. And that would be quite similar to a mayor. And the chief would have to be, back then, it would have to be male. You'd have to be from a really good family. You'd have to be a very good hunter. And it was usually hereditary. So if the first-born male wasn't that great of a hunter, it might go to the second-born male of that family. And the reason being is the chief is not a chief because of just title. The chief was actually responsible for everybody in his community who might not be able to hunt like our elders. So the chief would, in essence, be responsible to make sure that everybody is looked after and nobody is left behind. In the summer, in the spring, and the fall, we lived in big community groups. But then in the winter, well, actually, probably late fall, we would go into small, different family units all across Mi'kma'ki. And it was, in essence, I think, a way for us to be able to survive. We would be able to capture and dry enough food for our small little family units. We would make little homes, little lodges in the woods all over Mi'kma'ki, and we'd have enough food for our families to be able to survive. Now, the children, as most people would think, the children would be sort of our little dependents, but our children played a role in our community. Our children would be the ones that would go and try to find the birds' eggs. They would help collect the wood for the fire. They had a role in our community, a very big role. Like as soon as they could walk and talk and they were able, they did have a role. And then when you look at the women who are our nurturers, they were the ones who would do all the sewing, the looking after the lodge, the looking after the elders, the children, all of those roles. And when the men were gone, they were also the ones who had to go and fish and hunt and provide for the family while the men were gone. So they had a very huge role. And they were also the storytellers as well. Our men were the ones who looked after us and took care of us and made sure that we had enough food for the winter. They were our protectors when there were wars. They would sacrifice themselves so that the community would be able to live. They had their own ceremonies and customs and practices, and they would teach our young boys those ceremonies and customs and teach them how to be the men that our communities needed at the time. I couldn't even imagine that there would be times where there was sickness, times where there would be drought, times when the food was scarce, times when it was so very hard. But we managed to survive, and that would be because we were all gifted the ability to be able to help us move forward. So, as you can imagine, every night we would gather by our fires, and it would be the elders that would share the stories of long, long ago. Stories like our creation stories, stories of why things are the way they are, stories that talk about what we should do, what we shouldn't do, how to be good people. They would incorporate our seven sacred teachings. They would give us a clue of who we were so we would know who we're supposed to be when we're bigger and older for our young ones, and to remind us who we are. The story goes where there was a young girl one night who had a horrible nightmare. And she woke up and she told her mother, she said, I dreamed that I saw a rock being dragged across the water by clouds, these great big white clouds. And I felt such anxiety over it. It scared me. And within a few weeks, they looked out from the shore and they could literally see what looked like a rock being dragged across the water by these two big clouds. And in fact, it was one of the first boats that were coming over with big white billowy sails. And as the ship got closer, they actually thought that there was bears climbing all over it. But it was in fact Europeans that had finally come, and they landed. And when they realized that they were people, they let their guard down and they talked for a bit, or tried to communicate for a bit. And one of the missionaries was there, and he wanted to instantly try to convert us and pointed up to the heavens and talked about God. And of course, the indigenous people looked up and, you know, the Creator is up there, so maybe that's what they're talking about. And through the first years, we helped them, we looked after them, we taught them how to survive in this horrible, horrible climate that they probably weren't even used to, with the cold, cold winters and the hot, hot summers, and what was safe to eat, what wasn't safe to eat. We directed them through all of that. And then when they started talking about land, we couldn't understand or fathom what they were talking about, because land to us was an extension of our family. You can't own family. So that's when things really started to change, and definitely for the worst after colonization, when we were learning over time what land meant to them compared to what it meant to us.
Life in Mi'kma'ki was forever changed by the arrival of European explorers and settlers, especially by the time of the founding of the French colony Acadie, or Acadia, in 1604. Generally, the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians was one of mutual respect and military alliance against the British, who also had claims on the region. A long series of wars between the French and the growing British Empire eventually brought much of Acadia and Mi'kma'ki under British occupation. Even during the Acadian expulsion of the 1750s, the Mi'kmaq continued to fight against the British. The fighting finally came to an end after the signing of a series of treaties known as the Peace and Friendship Treaties. The Mi'kmaq agreed to cease hostilities against the British in return for guaranteed rights of hunting, fishing, and gathering in ancestral Mi'kmaq territory, rights the Mi'kmaq had always had. The terms of the treaty signed in Halifax in 1760 to 1761 make no mention of surrender or the change of land ownership. The Mi'kmaq believed then, and continue to assert now, that they were never conquered, and that Mi'kma'ki remains sovereign Mi'kmaq territory. In the decades and centuries since the Peace and Friendship Treaties were signed, there have been several attempts to further define and uphold their terms. Perhaps most famous is the 1999 Marshall decision by the Supreme Court of Canada. Donald Marshall Jr., a Mi'kmaq fisherman from Cape Breton, was charged with violating federal fishing laws, including a charge of fishing out of season. Marshall's legal representatives referenced the 1760 treaty to argue that he was catching and trading fish just as the Mi'kmaq had done before the arrival of Europeans, all in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. In an historic decision, the Supreme Court reversed the convictions against Marshall and affirmed his treaty rights. Shortly after this victory, a controversial decision called Marshall II emphasized that Mi'kmaq treaty rights could be limited, but only for reasons of wildlife conservation. These and other legal battles involving the Peace and Friendship Treaties and the concept of moderate livelihood continue to inspire fierce debate and sometimes confrontation between government, Mi'kmaq fishers, and non-Indigenous peoples.
I always do the traditional Mi'kmaq welcome, which is I am Mi'kmaq, and I reside in this beautiful, unceded territory known as Mi'kma'ki, and I'd like to welcome you in peace and friendship. And when I say that, what I'm doing is I am acknowledging the fact that my ancestors have walked on this land from time immemorial. And as a nation, we were never defeated. We never surrendered. That land is still our land. It is unceded because we never signed it away. I know that it doesn't mean that all of a sudden Prince Edward Island is all Mi'kma'ki. It belongs to the two First Nations, because I've heard some people say, well, does that mean I'm going to lose my house if it's on PEI and this happens? It's like, no, it isn't about us coming in and taking everybody's houses or taking over the land. When we acknowledge the fact that the land is still the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, that means that traditionally this is where we were, this is where we worked, this is where we lived, this is where we lived our lives, this is where our ancestors hunted and fished and gathered and did all of those different things. And nation to nation, we need to connect and create what this moderate livelihood means. We need to be able to decide what the boundaries are as nation to nation. We have to figure out the best compromise to make sure that everybody is looked after. And although the rights and treaties, like the treaties of peace and friendship, although a lot of the things in there have sort of fallen by the wayside, that I think it's time to revisit those and to see, what we could do working together to move forward in a good way from here.